Good morning. Welcome back. This is our second and final episode on Imaginative Apologetics. For those of you who were here last time, I had introduced our speaker as someone I've known for a long time. A couple of people have asked, is she my daughter? No. Welcome my sister, Dr. Melody Green, who's the Dean and Associate Professor of Christianity and Culture at Urbana Theological Seminary in Urbana, Illinois. I just want to draw your attention. There's a course listings for the spring, a little pamphlet about the Inklings Tour in September of 2025, and Biblical Turkey, where Paul did much of his work, in May of 2025, for those of you who would have more interest about some of the work that my little sister, Dr. Dean Green, is involved in. So before she comes up and continues the discussion that we so appreciated from a couple of weeks ago, let me open us in a moment of prayer. Lord, you have made us in your image. You have fearfully and wonderfully designed us. And amongst the many capacities and abilities you've given us is imagination, is the capacity to represent things within us, to even explore that which we actually cannot see and cannot hold, but yet is very real. We thank you for these gifts you've given us in this time that we've had offered to us today, that we can set aside whatever would distract us and to be fully present with you and each other during this time. We come to you with gratitude in Jesus' name. Amen.
So I am going to start with a little bit of shameless self-promotion. My brother mentioned a couple flyers in the back. By the way, thank you for letting me come back this week. I really had a lot of fun last time. And, when somebody invites you to speak once, you never know how they responded, right? But then when they let you come back a second time, it must be okay. So, as my brother mentioned, Urbana Theological Seminary, we are an interdenominational seminary. Many of our classes are held over Zoom, so anyone who wants to can audit or take a class for credit. This is our spring course schedule. If anybody's interested, I am teaching a class on Madeleine L'Engle this spring, looking at her theology, how it works in her books. We also take a lot of trips. We have a part of the seminary called Training Through Travel. As he mentioned, there is a trip to Biblical Turkey that we're doing in May. It's going to go to places like Antioch. Wow, my mind just totally went blank. Anyway, you can read it in here. But a lot of the New Testament takes place in Turkey. And a lot of where Paul went are places in Turkey. Places that John talks up to in Revelation are in Turkey. That tour hits all of the 7 churches of Revelation and several places Paul went. Then there's also the Inklings Tour. I'm the person who leads this. This one is going to be in September. The deadline to get your money in for the Turkey trip, if you decide to do it, is pretty soon. The Inklings, or at least the down payment, the Inklings trip is in September. The down payment isn't until June. Something to think about, but we go to Oxford, Cambridge, Birmingham, and London, and look at places that were parts of the lives of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and we get to see some of Chesterton's papers when we're in London. So, I hope you could join us for those things. The flyers about them are in the back. There's also a handout that's been going around. These are the sources. Like last week, I mentioned a lot of different things. If you are interested in knowing more, books mentioned from last week are at the top. Selected related resources you might also find interesting are at the bottom. And then on the back, I have a list of books that are things that people have called imaginative apologetics when they've been talking about it. Stories that retell the gospel or have parts of the stories that in different ways point people to Christ. So, thank you for letting me come back. What I'm going to do now, after that shameless self-promotion, I'm going to talk about, last week I threw a lot of ideas at you. This week, I'm going to talk about a couple of more ideas. Then we're going to spend some time talking about how imaginative apologetics actually works. Because there's one thing to say there's a lot of stories that point us to Christ in different ways, but sometimes when we talk about how it actually works versus the theory, it comes out differently. And I thought the best way to do that might actually be to share stories that I know from people. Most of the ones I'm going to share are from people I actually know, about how story brought them to Christ or changed the way they thought about something spiritual in their own lives. But I'm going to start, and then we're going to hopefully have time to open it up for conversation. So here we go. I'm going to start with a quote. Stories, it has been said, are as old as bread. I like that image because it links stories to something as indispensable to our survival as food. Just as good bread can often nourish and fortify the soul even more than it does the body, so stories have a profound effect on the growth, the image, and the perceived needs and desires of the body, indeed, of the whole person. From our very first beginnings, we are fed stories, embraced by stories, nourished by stories. The only way we come to make sense of the world is through the stories we are told. They pattern the world we have fallen into, effectively replacing its terrors and inconsistencies with structured images that assure us. What does she mean by that? From the moment we are very small children, we are hearing stories. We tend to not even notice how much information is given to us through story. Think about when you're a kid and you're at a family thing, and all these people are telling stories about, oh, that great uncle who went on that trip, or oh, that cousin who did that crazy thing. Even the language that's in that story is giving you ideas as a child about, oh, that trip is good. That thing that uncle did was crazy. You're picking up all kinds of things through the pattern of story as well as the language that stories are told in. Dr. Karen Coates is actually, as it says, the director of Center for Research in Children's Literature at Cambridge. She is also a Christian herself who looks at how story works, the same way we've been talking about people like Holly Ordway and even C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. So another point I wanted to make this morning before we talk about the stories that I'm going to share is the Bible as story. Now, I have on here, it says the Bible is as much as 3/4 story. Now, why I say as much as is I've seen different biblical scholars define different parts of the Bible as story or even not story. So when we start talking about what is a story, some people might even say, well, when you look at the prophets, some of those prophecies, they're all prophecy. And other people will go, wait a minute. That prophecy is full of different stories, of examples. Read the book of Daniel. There's that great story about the monsters that come out of the water that all look different. A lot of it is story, even embedded within the prophecies. And then 1/3 of everything Jesus is recorded to have said is story. So the God who made us, who gave us our very being, who made us in his image, is a God who tells stories, who teaches through story. As Madeline L'Engle says in her book, Walking on Water, Reflections on Faith and Art, Jesus was not a theologian. He was God who told stories. So I'm going to tell you a couple stories about people whose story shaped how they became a Christian or part of their life, their spiritual life. And the first one is one I'm sure you all are familiar with. It was C.S. Lewis. His grandfather was a pastor. He grew up as a small child going to his grandfather's church. His mother dies when he is 9 years old, but he and his brother received Bibles as gifts from her before she died because she said that was the most important thing she wanted them to hold on to. In spite of that, he became an atheist at a very young age, and his journey to faith ended up taking more than 2 decades. He describes in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, most of that journey. Not all of it is in there. You find parts of it in his letters as well. But we find when we put it all together, there's a wonderful book I don't have on this handout that you should read if you're really interested. It's by a guy named David Downing. It is called The Most Reluctant Convert, and it actually puts all of the pieces together, the letters, Surprised by Joy, other places that people have even talked about, conversations they had with Lewis. Puts it all together to tell the story of his conversion. But what you see when you put it all together is that story played an important role in this journey. One of the things that Lewis talks about in Surprised by Joy is a book called Fantastes. It's by a guy named George MacDonald. George MacDonald was a Scottish pastor who also wrote more than 40 books. Well, he wrote more than 40 realistic fiction books, and then he wrote a lot of fairy tales, and he wrote some fantasy stories. He's even been described as the father of modern fantasy, the person who shaped this genre we think of as fantasy today. And he wrote these books not just for the fun of it, but to try to give people an image of God, of holiness, of different things that we need to understand what they are as Christians. Even things like redemption, justification show up in George MacDonald's fairy tales. Well, this young atheist C.S. Lewis is at a train station going somewhere for the weekend, and he says he has a whole weekend free ahead of him to do nothing but read. And so he steps into a bookstore on the train station, finds this book Fantastes, and reads it over the weekend. In Surprised by Joy, he says he met something in that book that he didn't know what it was, but the book baptized his imagination, made him start thinking in a different way. It was something that later, when he looked back, he said, oh, part of my journey to Christ changed when I read this book. And later he says that it could only be described as holiness. The book gave him an understanding of something that he had never gotten, for whatever reason, being dragged to church every week as a kid, or even when he was in school and going to chapel and you have to sit there because it's part of your school experience, that somehow this book did something that none of those other things did. It showed him holiness. He describes the sensation as having imbued not just the difference, that otherness that is God, but the world itself has been affected by this. In the same way that Chesterton calls wonder, and Holly Ordway, who we talked about last week, calls enchantment. So later in his life, Lewis is a professor at Oxford, and there's that story that has affected him, but there's other stories that he loves. Again, in Surprised by Joy, there's a point where he says, you do not understand my story if you don't understand how important Norse mythology was to him as a teenager. He read everything about Norse mythology he could get his hands on. And that actually even helped him build a friendship with another professor who was a Christian when he was not a Christian. This Professor J.R.R. Tolkien had, of all things, a book discussion group where they would get together every week and read Norse mythology in the original medieval Icelandic language. Now, as you do, right? Because that's what we all do for fun. But that caught the young the professor, C.S. Lewis's attention because he had loved these books as a teenager, but had only read them in translation or even children's retellings. So he gets to know this guy Tolkien, who's having this group read these books out loud together. They build a closer friendship. And eventually there's a day, September 29th or 30th, 1931, Lewis, Tolkien, and another friend of theirs, Hugo Dyson, have dinner together at Magdalen College, and then they go to Lewis's rooms and talk more, and then they end up going out for a walk. If you ever get the chance, like that Inklings tour that I mentioned earlier shamelessly, I apologize, we will actually go on Addison's Walk and do the 1 mile walk as part of that tour. But it's late at night. We will not be doing it late at night. Late at night, they go on this walk that's on Magdalen College's grounds, and they're talking about myth. And Lewis is arguing that myth is lies breathed through silver. They're great stories, but they don't really mean anything. They have no weight. And then he argues that the story of Jesus is just another myth. It's just like the dying god Balder in Norse mythology, he's the god of goodness and light, and then he gets killed by a trick because of Loki, and then all goodness dies, and it's horrible. And Lewis is like, it's the same story. It's just another myth. And Tolkien does something really interesting. Instead of saying, oh, no, it's not, he said, you know what, you're right. It is the same story. It's the same story as Osiris in Egyptian mythology. He said, but there's a difference. This story happened at a real time, in a real place, to a real person. And all of these other myths are pointing us to that. They exist not because this is just another one of those, but because this is the real one, that every one of those other stories is a pattern of, a reflection of, how could they not exist if this wasn't true? That they're all pointing us to Christ. And Lewis, now what's funny about this is Tolkien went home thinking that he had not made his point at all, and even wrote a poem called Mythopoeia that you may want to read. It's all about how the stories we tell reflect God, and we create because we were created in his image, and our stories reflect his story. But Tolkien goes home thinking he did not get it across to Lewis at all. But a few days later, Lewis writes a letter to a friend of his named Arthur Greaves. And he's explaining this walk. And he said, now what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of a sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving God, Baldur, Osiris, Bacchus, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened. Now, he doesn't go into a lot of detail about this conversation in Surprised by Joy. He just mentions that he had this important conversation, which you can find in his letters. But then he says, a few days after that important conversation, he was in the sidecar of his brother's motorcycle, and they were on their way to the zoo. And he said, the way he words it is, when I got into the sidecar, I was not a Christian. When I got to the zoo, I was. So part of Lewis's conversion is things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as ways to bring people to Christ, right? Let's talk about gods that don't exist, to point people to the God who does exist. That seems counterintuitive. But that's a good part of how imaginative apologetics works. It's things that we don't normally expect that point people to Christ in ways that we wouldn't expect it. So I'm now going to tell you the stories of 5 different people I know who have had story shape their faith. And this will help us think more about how it could work, maybe in the lives of people you know who don't want to go to church, and they're like, oh yeah, I already know all about Jesus, and for whatever reason have been pushed away, but they might actually really like something else that you can say, hey, let's talk about this. So student number 1, I'm not giving you their names, even though I do have their permissions to share the stories. Student number 1, we'll call him R. Ooh, that kind of sounds piratey, right? R. He would love that. When he first signed up for my Tolkien class, I said, hey, so tell me why you want to take a Tolkien class. I've learned not to ask that question anymore, usually, because sometimes the answers are things like, well, it looked like it was an easier credit than hermeneutics, too. But he said, I'm so glad you asked, because that's how I became a Christian. I was like, oh, tell me more. He was raised in a non-Christian family. He was a teenager when somebody gave him a copy of The Lord of the Rings. He fell in love with the story. He started reading it once a year, every year. What is it that got him? The story of this returning king. There's these people who are living in darkness. There's an evil dark lord who is wanting to destroy everything. And everybody's hope is in a place nobody expected. There's this king who's got to return, or who's going to return. Nobody expects him to return, but he does. And when he does, his return that reshapes the whole world, makes everything good and beautiful again, happens because of the strangest sacrifice that was made. As a young non-Christian from a family that did not go to church and had not exposed him to anything really faith-related, he knew he wanted more of that. But he didn't know what that story was or how to find it until one day he went to a Christmas Eve service with a friend. And in that Christmas Eve service, in the songs that people were singing, he said, wait a minute, this is about a king who's returning, a light shining in the darkness. And that is how his journey to faith not just began, but he says it happened right there, that he knew this is what he needed, and he needed to find out how to get it. That was R. I'm going to share another one, S. Now, she was a really interesting student of mine because her story actually involves three stories. She had gone to church some when she was a kid. Her parents were divorced. Her mother would go to church. When she would visit her mom, she would go to church with her mom, and she was angry at her mom, and everything was horrible, according to her, in her life at that time. But there were 3 stories that changed the way she thought about everything. The first one was Star Wars. She's watching the first Star Wars movie, and there's this character who, from the perspective of this young person watching it, seemed to die to save everybody else at that point. Obi-Wan Kenobi. You guys remember this? He's in front of Darth Vader. Luke Skywalker comes running in, and suddenly Darth Vader kills Obi-Wan Kenobi in front of them. But because that happened, all these other things happened too. And she's like, oh, that is fascinating. Because this guy died, good things happen for other people. And then the second one was the Harry Potter stories. Now, I know there's a lot of debate and discussion about Harry Potter. I actually teach a whole class called What's a Christian to Do with Harry Potter? But for the sake of this story, we're just going to talk about what she saw in it. She's reading this book, and here she is, an angry young kid, and this series of books about these people who continually put the needs of other people in front of them. People who take risks with their own life to take care of other people, to help people who couldn't be helped in any other way. And then she gets to the last book, and I do apologize if you've never read the Harry Potter books or seen the movie. I am going to ruin the story for you. There's a point when there's a group of children and there's a group of adults these adults have been fighting evil. They're called the Order of the Phoenix. The phoenix is a bird that dies and rises again. They are called the Order of the Phoenix. They fight evil every way they can. Then there's a group of children who are in this school who are protected by the Order of the Phoenix and other people. There's a point when the evil Dark Lord has the entire school under siege, and they are fighting against him, and it looks like the battle's losing. And then this Dark Lord says, I'll make you a deal. Give me Harry Potter, and I'll let you guys live, and you can serve me. And everybody says, well, we can't do that because he's our hope. There's been a prophecy that he will be the one to defeat the Dark Lord. Think you know how this story goes, right? He, instead of listening to everybody who says you need to stay safe and protected, he walks out alone into the woods where he is killed. And of course, the people in the castle believe the Dark Lord, makes a big deal out of it. And, I've killed Harry Potter. Look. They believe he's gone and that all hope is gone. But then there's this sudden change. I'll tell you, I'll ruin it since I've ruined this much, right? He comes back to life again. And now, because he has died to save everybody in that castle, the sentence is even said, they are protected by his blood. So my student S, and so of course the Dark Lord has no power over them anymore. My student S read that and didn't quite get yet why it caught her attention and why she loved it so much. She even got a tattoo of a phoenix on her shoulder because she wanted to be like the Order of the Phoenix and fight evil. And then she watched Doctor Who. Again, there's a lot of things to talk about in Doctor Who, but one of the things that got her attention was an episode where there's these aliens. If you don't know Doctor Who, it's a pretty wild story. It's a show that really requires the willing suspension of disbelief. But there are these aliens who are going to invade the Earth and destroy it. And there's one guy who stands, and he's wearing his pajamas because of that particular episode. He looks completely weak and helpless, and they're all armed to the teeth, and they have these warships that are ready to destroy the Earth. And he stands in front of them and says, this planet is defended. And he talks about how he values humans, and he will fight to the end, and he will win, and he will sacrifice whatever it takes because this planet is defended. It wasn't until a few years after that episode, when she had all 3 of these things kind of, as she said, swirling in her brain, that she went to college and she was invited to church by a friend. Now notice, again, this wasn't just the stories did it on their own. It was that when she was invited to church, a college church, by a friend, that she started going, oh, wait, these things that my mom always talked about in church that I was always too mad to listen to are the same things that I love in these stories, and the same things that that pastor's talking about right now. And that was her journey to faith. And I'm going to tell you another one, M is interesting for other reasons. But you may remember in the 80s, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it that way. You may remember in the 1980s, there was a Disney movie called The Black Cauldron. Some people have described it as one of the worst Disney cartoons ever made. It's dark. It's loosely based on a series of children's books called The Prydain Cycle. It's got part of the first book, some of the second book, and a little bit of the fifth book, all mixed into one. But in the books, there's a character that they talk about that you don't meet until book 5. He is called High King Math. And the way explained it is when she was a kid, she's about 5th grade, reading The Prydain Cycle, really enjoying it, and she's really fascinated by the High King Math has this son who wanders around the world and is helping people, and he is the prince, and he's called the prince, and everybody likes the prince, and sometimes bad things happen to the prince, but he helps people figure things out and solve things, and he, again, that whole message of putting other people before yourself. And then near the end, we meet the High King because the prince takes people to meet him. She was in church, and they were singing this song. And you know the song, I bet, most of you, if not all of you. It gets to like the 4th verse, which she was a kid who didn't really listen that much to verses, but all of a sudden, the 4th verse of the song has these words, High King of heaven, my victory thou art. And for the first time, those words, High King, made sense to her. We live in a culture that we have presidents. We don't really even necessarily like kings very much. That word, High King, doesn't always make a lot of sense to us, even today, as we read that. But when she had read that book and saw how important the High King was in that series, and how his son, who's the heir to the throne, doesn't even just sit there and go, I'm the prince, but no, he's fighting for his father's name. That's when she finally understood what those words meant, High King of heaven. Then there's B. B, when she was a child, was given a book called The Wind in the Willows. You may remember this book. There have been many movies based on it. It's about talking animals. And there's a mole and a rat. But there's a chapter in the book that often gets left out in the movies that are based on it. And what happens in that chapter is there's a baby otter. Again, the animals are all people-like. There's a baby otter who has disappeared. And Mole and Rat decide that they're going to help search for the missing baby otter. It's late at night, and there's a beautiful description of the moon on the water and all kinds of things like that. And Mole and Rat are away from the rest of the people, looking in a different part of the river. They even talk about, maybe, there are traps and things. And they're concerned. Everybody's concerned. But then they hear music that they don't recognize, but it's beautiful music, and it draws them. Does anybody here remember this part of the story, if you ever read the book? It draws them to a little island where they meet. It never says a name for this character, but he ultimately is the god Pan, but they meet this person that one of them looks to the other and says, are you afraid? And he said, oh, of him, never. And then he said, oh, but I am afraid, very afraid. Well, that character never says a word to them. He just shows them that he has the child at his feet, protected. And they are the ones who rescue the child and bring him back to his parents. And there's all this joy at the end of the story, or that chapter. Bea was telling me how that was, for her, a moment in reading that book that made her, for the first time, realize there's something other out there. The rest of the book is very much anything like your regular world. There's friends who have conversations, who get into danger. There's a guy named Toad of Toad Hall who does some really stupid things, like he steals a car at one point. They're all things that could feasibly happen to real people. But then there's this one chapter that is something other, that points to something outside, and that character is even described as the protector of the weak and the young, the protector of those who need protection. That it's not explained. In fact, the author's not even a Christian, which, as you may notice, the author of Star Wars and people who write for Doctor Who don't usually call themselves Christians. That's not what they may have even intended and what these people are getting from these stories are two different things. But it's how God can use stories. So I'm going to end this part of this talk with one more story about one more person. And this is Jay. Jay is actually retired, what does he teach? Or what did he used to teach? Good grief. Give me a moment. I should know this. Physics, thank you. He was I don't know who I'm thinking. Well, I do, but he's a retired physics professor. And he's taken several of my classes, and he keeps asking me when I'm going to teach a murder mystery class a whole semester. And I said, probably never. But I have given some talks on it as a genre that points people to Christ. And Jay wants this because that was part of his story. Why? Well, when you read a murder mystery, what happens? Something bad happens. Somebody dies. That's part of the requirement. Someone comes in who's going to clarify a dark situation. As they're looking through all of these things happening, everybody's sin comes to light. Everybody, anything wrong you did, if this murder happened near you, everybody's going to know you did something wrong. The situation is resolved by the Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple or whoever, Lord Peter Wimsey or whoever, saying, I know who did it, here's how we know who did it, and making that person take responsibility for what they did. But everybody else also has to figure out how to take responsibility for what they did. And what Jay said is when he read these books or started reading these books, he realized for the first time, you can't take these books seriously unless you take sin seriously. These books rely on an assumption that sin is real and sin is something we have to take care of, which then led Jay to try to figure out, well, how do we take care of sin in our own lives? Because it's there. Again, these were examples of different ways that different kinds of stories and different stories have shaped the lives of people I know in terms of how it brought them to faith. And this is something very different than what we did last week, which was go through a lot of different theory about how this works. But some things to notice. First of all, while fantasy is a particularly useful genre, the people who write about imaginative apologetics almost always are talking about fantasy. Other genres work as well. I would say it doesn't even matter if a character is called a wizard, a detective, or a saint. It's their inner character. What they do, how they do it, the consequences of their actions are far more important than those labels. What is the structure of the story? What is being resolved? What is happening in this story? Is it a murder mystery where somebody is actually trying to resolve somebody did something wrong, responsibility has to happen? Or is it a story about a group of 4 hobbits that go on a journey to destroy a ring to save the world? It's the character. It's who they are, how they grow, maybe, how they affect the people around them, what sacrifices they are making, that ultimately are what draw people in to Christ. So how do we think about this? We look for ways a story can, what we call map. A story that will bring someone closer to Christ may not have been written for that purpose, but it will have things that are in common with the gospel story. And I've put 2 pictures up here that might be a little odd. One is from the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. Now, if you know that musical, you know that there is heresy in that musical. And yet I know 5 people whose journey to Christ began by watching that musical. All 5 of them watched it and said, I want to know more about that. Now, some of them I have even had conversations with. They're like, I would never let anybody else see that, but I love the music still because it's what brought them to Christ. The other one I have a picture here is from Batman. one of the Batman movies, there's a scene where everybody is in darkness, and Batman breaks through this, I think it was a wall or something. I've only seen the movie once. He breaks through something, and all these people who are trapped and they're going to die, he has a torch. And he even says something like, "Follow the light." And everybody follows him. And there's this image of the light and the darkness and all these people following one person leading the way out of the darkness. Now, why did I put that here? Oh, there was a light shining in the darkness? That should sound familiar. I have a niece, I'll admit this, I have a niece that I've had conversations with about how Batman is a story that reflects part of the Christian story in things about how he saves other people, he fights evil. And that does lead to something we should think about. When we know somebody who loves a story that we can say, oh, hey, maybe there's something in that story, we need to look for the opportunities to talk. We want to keep our focus on the positive connections between the story and the spiritual, what I'm going to call the spiritual idea. When a story was written with an imaginative apologetics purpose, that's easy. We can see it. We can say, hey, look at Aslan, he's Jesus. But you also want to make sure that the story does its work before we talk about what it means. And here's why I say that. Another example, there's a person I know who is a Tolkien scholar who was telling me a couple years ago that, she is not a Christian. She does not like Christianity. And I said, well, hey, have you ever read the Narnia books? And she's like, oh, I started one. And then somebody said, oh, did you know C.S. Lewis is a Christian? And then she said, that made me not want to read the rest of the book. So we need to think about, yes, at some point that conversation should happen. But when do we do that? There's a wonderful, this is going to be a strange sentence for people who know me. There's a wonderful guy who was one of the people who started AI, and he had worked on AI for 20 years. In the 1990s, he wrote a book called Tell Me a Story. It's all about how, at the time he was writing it, he said, we can't make computers think like humans because humans need story. They think in story. And one of the things he says in that book is intelligence is having something to say and knowing when to say it. And that's what, at that time, he said, we cannot teach people or teach computers how to do, but people can do it. Having something to say and knowing when to say it. Now, he goes on to say, having something to say is knowing story, knowing about stories. So knowing that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a Christian book is an important thing. Knowing how Aslan represents Christ, what does he tell us? What does the story tell us about the atonement is really important. Knowing when to bring that up is the other part of it. But there's also stories that were not written with the purpose of apologetics, as several of the examples I gave you show. When that happens, sometimes I've been in conversations even with people who are going, hey, I noticed this thing. They know I'm a Christian. They know I work at a seminary. I'm going to give another example. I call them the accept that's. I was in a situation, and this is exactly why I have this picture up here, because it was this episode of the TV show Doctor Who that a group of us were talking about. If you don't know the show, Doctor Who is this alien. He travels across planets. He loves humans. But there's one particular story where he lands on a planet, and he meets a lot of different kinds of aliens, and they have all kinds of adventures, but he lands on a planet that immediately somebody grabs his hand and sticks it in a machine. He doesn't know what planet he's on. He doesn't know what is going on. It takes a piece of his skin and immediately makes a new person. And he's explained to, after this, that, that's just how people come into being in our world. We take a piece of skin from another person, put it in a machine, and now we've got this new person. Well, this person who was just created on this new planet is of the essence of the Doctor, but completely born the way people on that planet are born. Oh, does that sound a little bit like the language of the incarnation? So the story goes on. There's a battle happening on this planet, but this planet is only 7 days old. It is the 7th day of their new planet that these other people have terraformed, and they've already messed it up. Well, again, I'm going to totally ruin the story for you. One person at one point points a weapon at the doctor. The doctor is saying, you guys need rules. You need to be able to, figure out these rules to help you love each other, to take care of each other. And he's explaining rules, and somebody pulls out a weapon and says, well, this is stupid, and points the weapon at the doctor. The doctor's child, that's of his essence, but also born of the same way people on that planet are, steps in between the weapon and the doctor and dies. After 3 days, she comes back to life again. Notice two things. First, it's the story of Jesus. But I also said she. So I was in a conversation with a group of people who were talking about this episode, and one of the things that somebody said almost immediately, this person who's in a place where their life, they know, they went to church when they were a kid, they know, but they also don't go to church now. And she was talking to me about some of the things she was seeing in this episode. I'm like, yeah, I like the incarnation. Yeah, like Jesus' resurrection. And this other person goes, yeah, except that Jesus wasn't a woman. I'm like, that is a conversation that should happen at some point. But that actually ended up shutting down that entire conversation. It's like, of course we know that. And that does lead to other conversations. But avoiding the except that's too early in the conversation helps us keep that door open instead of closing it. We've got a few minutes left. I did take a little longer sharing those stories, but I hope those can help you think about how what we talked about last time can be applied to real-life situations. But I was hoping for these last couple minutes, if we have any questions, thoughts, I'd love to hear from you guys. Like I said, I know what I did this week was very different than last week. I gave you stories to think about. Question back there. Yes?
Do you have any recommendations for younger, 6 to 12-year-old?
Yes. On the handout, that should be some of them back there as well, if you didn't get one. On the back, I have selected recommended fiction. These are all stories that people have talked about in relation to imaginative apologetics. Stories I would recommend for the 6 to 12-year-olds. I should have put age levels on here, but I didn't. A lot of these are for grown-ups, but if you look on here, there is David and Karen Main's Tales of the Kingdom. It's a 3-volume set that are parables literally written to help people think about the gospel and what it means to live as a Christian, things like that. There's also on here, for the more closer to the 12-year-old, Jerry Jenkins, the Wormling series. Now, I know Jerry Jenkins co-wrote the Left Behind books, which might be a good reason for us to say, maybe not Jerry Jenkins, but these are actually really good. They have some really good theology buried in them. If it's a 12-year-old girl, Hind's Feet on High Places is definitely an interesting one for that age. A 12-year-old boy, Stephen Lawhead's Dragon King trilogy. Okay, girls will read them too, but you know. George MacDonald, The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, At the Back of the North Wind. Andrew Peterson's Wing Feather Saga. Elizabeth Pope, more for, I would say, 12 to 16. Charlie Starr's King Lesterlight's Chronicles. John White's Archives of Anthropos, not so much 6, but the 12, 11, 12, those would be really good. This one's out of print. There's only one on this list that I know of is out of print. Samuel Wright's The Music Machine. There's a audio CD, there was a movie, and there was a novel, and they all told completely different stories. And the novel, The Music Machine, is actually about these children. It's very much like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. These children go to a place called Agape Land, and they have to, it sounds really corny at first, they have to rescue the music machine, because the music machine teaches you like the fruits of the Spirit and the 10 Commandments and things like that. It actually is a very sweet, very cute story. It's a really good question. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have any follow-up where the authors have discovered and been made aware of deeper meaning of the story that they have? Here I'm thinking about the Harry Potter series.
Yes.
Well, actually,
So that is an excellent question. There's 3 people who I thought of immediately, but I'll start with the Harry Potter series since you mentioned that. J.K. Rowling actually said in 2007 in the MTV interviews and in an interview in a newspaper in Canada that she is a Christian, that she kept that secret because she figured if everybody knows I'm a Christian, then they're going to know how my story ends, and they're not going to even want to read it. It is still a very interesting conversation for a lot of reasons, but that is one that you mentioned, so I threw that one in there quickly. There's also, I can picture the book. Susan is her first name. I cannot think of her last name. She wrote a book called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. About 20 years ago, it was a bestseller. It's a little bit like George MacDonald's Fantasties, if you have read that. It's a little bit like Jane Austen meets a fantasy world. But she was not a Christian when she wrote that book. And I, weirdly enough, know somebody who knows her, and we were talking at a conference, and I said, her books have changed. And he's like, well, yeah. After she wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, people were pointing out things that are worth thinking about. And she is now a Christian. And even she still writes books in that world that have a very different angle, we'll say. The third one is not as happy of a story. It's Ursula Le Guin. She wrote a series in the 60s and 70s called the Earthsea Trilogy. I like them a lot. I like Ursula Le Guin, but the Earthsea Trilogy, people were saying, hey, look, it's an allegory like The Lord of the Rings and like the Chronicles of Narnia. That word allegory itself is a complicated word for this. But she said, no, I'm not a Christian. And she ended up in the 80s and into the 90s writing more books in that series to prove that that's not what she meant at all. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. Yes. Yes, that the Holy Spirit works in ways that we are not necessarily expecting. That's an excellent point. Thank you.